Welcome back. It's time for another Waterproof Records, and the day that I'm recording this is Valentine's Day 2024. I don't know if you celebrate or get into it. I don't very much. I'm not that crazy about it, but if you are celebrating right now, well, you'll be hearing this after the fact. But anyway, I guess I'll just say, I love you. Happy Valentine's Day. But that's not why you're here. You're not here to hear all the ways that I care about you, and I appreciate having you listen to the show. You're here to talk about bands and music, and specifically this band, because you saw the title of the episode, which we're on episode 53 now, which is kind of wild to me. We are adding up these numbers. It's a slow start on the show when I first started making Waterproof Records because it was so spaced out, but now we're getting pretty consistent, and I feel like before we know it, we'll be on the 100th episode, and by that time, maybe I'll get my shit together. But until then, we can just keep talking about bands. But I chose this band on this holiday for very specific reasons. The love holiday. The love holiday. And you'll see why. But let's just jump into the show. I'm excited to do this one because I have so much to say. So without wasting any more time, it's time to talk about Nothing Shocking by Jane's Addiction. Let's go!
Things are gonna change, I can feel it. If this gonna be that kind of party, I'm gonna...
Waterproof Records. Waterproof Records. Waterproof Records with Jacob Gibbons.
Before we get into today's titillating topic, oh, that popped on the mic there, titillating. It's definitely titillating, especially if you've seen the cover of this album. But before we get to that titillation, we're going to talk about DistroKid, my sponsor, and one of the main reasons that I can make this show happen. So I have a special link, distrokid.com/VIP/waterproof. If you use that, 30% off your first year of music uploaded. You know about it. You've heard me talk about it. If this is the first time you're tuning in, DistroKid is how you get your music, your work out there to everyone like that. It's amazing. You use the service. They have an iOS app. You can upload your songs. You can split with everybody else in your band, or if you're a solo artist, they make it super easy to see how much you're earning, how many people are listening to your music, and you're immediately on Spotify and Tidal and all the different platforms that you can listen to music, YouTube, and they have a lot of extra features that you can enhance the art, the video, the way that your songs are being presented. So make sure you're taking advantage of DistroKid. Once again, my link is just distrokid.com/VIP/waterproof, and take advantage of that 30% off because, hey, it adds up. So that being said, it's time to talk about Nothing Shocking. And this is the first time that I'm going to do this on Waterproof Records, but it won't be the last. But I'm kind of going to double album it today. I'm going to kind of do two albums in this podcast because I don't think I can talk about Jane's Addiction and Nothing Shocking without talking about the first live album, their debut album, which is a live recording. But that album was released in 1987, and that album is commonly referred to as Triple X because it was on a Los Angeles label known as Triple X, so people call it Triple X, even though it's just Jane's Addiction. It's Jane's Addiction Live. And then their big studio, their first studio album, which is technically their second album, is Nothing Shocking. Now, this isn't really the point of entry for me because I think that when I first saw Jane's Addiction, that I can recall, I feel like I saw the Stop video on 120 Minutes, which is on Ritual, which is coming out in 1990. I was watching 120 Minutes, and I remember seeing the video for the song Stop, and I loved it. I have this very specific memory of sitting in 7th or 8th grade, and I was sitting in class, and I was singing kind of to myself. I was like, one come a day, the water will run, no man will stand for the things that he has done. Hoorah! I was singing that, and this kid behind me was like, is that a Christian song? And I was like, no. No, it's not. It's Jane's Addiction. It's part of Stop. But I said up top, I said I'm doing this on Valentine's Day, and I also told you that little story about the Christian element of it because I'm going to put out there right now as a warning, kind of a warning to you if you're listening in your car. And I know sometimes I drop the F-bombs on here when I get really passionate, or sometimes the subject matter gets a little bit heavier or emotional, and I'm not appropriate for all ages. But I would say this episode, more than others, there's going to be some talk about, there's going to be a little sex talk, and there's going to be some of the profanities. So if you don't like the profanities, you're going to want to cover your ears, because I'm going to drop a few, because you just can't help get a little bit naughty with Jane's Addiction. You know what I'm saying? Because that was the thing about this band, is that it felt naughty. You know what I'm talking about? It felt naughty when I was a young lad listening to bands. Of course, there were things like Two Live Crew or something that was like really raunchy, really naughty. But something about the energy of Jane's Addiction, it was dangerous. It felt wild, bacchanal, orgy-like, sensual, sexual, really had this crazy, wild energy. And for good reason, because the more you know about Jane's Addiction and Perry Farrell and this whole group coming together, they really present that energy in those days, and even still to this day in some ways, kind of that we're having a wild artistic experience with music. That seems to be a big part of the magic ingredient that is Jane's Addiction. But back to really the point of discovery. I see the video for Stop. I like it. And then, of course, Been Caught Stealing, their big hit. But like I was raised in a Christian household, so I'm not going to be able to go pick up Ritual de lo Habitual with the cover with the artistic boobies. And then let's go back to 1988's Nothing Shocking, which we're talking about in the front, which you all know was another controversial cover. If you've never seen it, there are two naked women conjoined with their hair on fire. But here's the thing. They're just statues. They're just sculptures. They are body casts made by Perry Farrell. He made them. They were body casts made from his girlfriend at the time, Casey Nicoli. And he put this structure together. So that's not even a real person. Those aren't two real women. It's just a sculpture. It's a work of art. And but yet it got in so much controversy at the time as a controversial cover. 9 out of the 11 major music retailers refused to carry it. I think it ended up being put in brown paper sleeves, because this is still before we have the parental advisory. And I think Ritual de lo Habitual would go on to have the cover that it initially had, and then it had this white cover, that was censoring it, which is the one that I think I ended up getting. But Nothing Shocking was shocking for young kids in 1990, 1991 that are just discovering this stuff, especially where I came from. Now, if you came from a place where you were exposed to a lot of different types of thing and art and whatever, but I came from a sheltered community, a church community, Tulsa, Oklahoma, buying CDs or tapes with boobies on the cover was just not going to fly. So it wasn't like I could rush out and buy after hearing Been Caught Stealing and hearing Stop and get that album. But the doorway opens. The doorway opens to Jane's Addiction, because my brother and I are listening to that college radio station, and he had a friend at the time who bought him Jane's Addiction live on cassette, got him that live album. So this is the doorway. This is the entry point. And this is why I want to talk about Nothing Shocking and that album. I didn't want to just do an album only on Jane's Addiction live, because I feel like it only goes so far. I want to talk about the evolution from that live album to their studio album. But Jane's Addiction live on cassette was a big deal for us. Big deal for Joel and I. Controversial because, again, it had that wild, unbridled feeling. I believe there's a scene in the film Parenthood, the original, the one with Steve Martin, where Keanu Reeves and Martha Plimpton are fooling around in their bedroom. And she leans over and she hits the tape player, and Pigs in Zen starts playing. And that really encapsulates the feeling that listening to something like Pigs in Zen felt like for me at the time. It felt like that's what the older teenage kids are making out and fooling around to in their bedrooms. You know, like here I am, I'm just hitting puberty. I'm just starting to grow up, but there are things starting to happen to the older kids. There's doors closing. There's discovery. You're hearing stories and you're thinking to yourself, you're like, Jane's Addiction feels like that wild party energy. Now, the first album that they put out in 87, this live album, it was recorded at the Roxy in LA. It's recorded live. But an interesting fact, if you didn't know this, they actually added in the crowd noise in post in the studio, and it was taken from a Los Lobos concert. If you didn't know that, that sound of like the crowd and whatnot is added in after the fact, because I believe they recorded the show. They had all the mics and whatnot, but you really can't, you know, I don't know if they got back in and they were like, wow, you really can't hear that this is live because you're just hearing the instruments. You're hearing these fine tuned, you know, they got all the coverage, but maybe the sound of the crowd just wasn't clear. So they're like, we want to make it clear that it's a live show. So I thought that was interesting. I never knew that because the crowd, the applause, the cheering, the timing of it all seems so specific and so real, but they added that in after the fact. But that first album, I have so many memories of my brother and I listening to it, and then him specifically, where he was in his faith at the time, a tremendous amount of religious guilt on him. You know, I remember him returning home one time from a Christian retreat and him taking the Jane's Addiction live and throwing it in the trash. Or, I mean, he told me he did. I went to look for it and he was like, I threw it away, you know? And I'm not criticizing my brother. We dealt with things like that all the time. You'd be at these Christian summer camps and you'd come home with this impulse that you got to get rid of your secular music. That was like a big thing back then, you know? But this album, I have so many memories of kicking it off with, you know, Trip Away, right? Trip Away. And then it closes with Chip Away. But there's so many amazing songs on here, but there's some standout moments, which are the Pigs in Zen on this album, as opposed to the Pigs in Zen on Nothing Shocking. I remember the one on the live one even more because Perry Farrell does these monologues, these like speeches in the middle of the songs. And the one on Nothing Shocking, he says a bunch of stuff like, leave a message, call you back, you know, which I remember when I had a answering machine in my room for a short time in college. I remember recording Leave a Message, Call You Back from Pigs in Zen as my little tape thing. But I digress. On the Jane's Addiction live album, he does this thing. He goes, I'm going to do it for you. He goes, oh, baby, I know about war, but I just want to fuck. And then he goes, I know about pain and suffering and being in the cold, but I just want to fuck. And I'm telling you right now, my little kid brain just exploded. I was like, it just felt so wild. You know, I didn't even know the weight of what he's saying there in those moments. I just hear him saying fuck. And I can remember it so clearly in my mind hearing this album and feeling that way. And the other standout moments of live are I Would For You. You know, this solitary bass-driven song, I Would For You. It's just the bass playing these chords back and forth. And, you know, I Would For You carries on and on. Now, this is very close around to the time where I get my first real major girlfriend, Kate. And he says... I always thought he said, I would for you, Kate, but I think he's saying, I would for you, Case, because he's talking about Casey Nicole. But I always thought he was saying, I would for you, Kate. So it had like that double meaning for me, you know, I would for you, Kate. That is beautiful. And I actually really enjoy Jane Says on the live album more than on Nothing Shocking. Because on Nothing Shocking, they added the steel drums. They added that reggae touch, which is cute. And that's what made it the big single that it is. You know, the one you know on the radio, the big Jane Says that's played around the world and everybody knows has those reggae steel drums. But the first version of Jane Says I ever heard was this very stripped down version on Jane's Addiction Live. And that's my preferred version. I like that one more. Before I forget the remaining songs, you know, like as I'm sitting here going through it, I don't have them in front of me, so it's not easy to remember, but there's the cover. I know most of you listen, but it had a painted Perry Farrell in the front, shirtless, kind of in some kind of, you know, like almost Navajo or Native American stylings around his body. But I, you know, see this in my mind so clearly. Yeah, we've got, opens up with Trip Away, like I thought, Whores, you know, songs like Whores. Little Jacob's mind is just being exposed to so many things. Pigs in Zen, 1%. I can tell you last year, I think it was last year, maybe it was 2022, I got to go see Porno for Pyros play. And I went to the Porno for Pyros show here in LA. And during the night, of course, Perry would bring out some Jane songs. And let me tell you right now, that night, they played 1% off of this album, off Jane's Addiction Live, and I lost my goddamn mind. I lost my mind. I was going nuts. I think I was at the Wiltern, and I remember looking around, like looking for acknowledgement to those around me, like, it's 1%. Can you believe it? I couldn't believe it, because this song is a song that I don't believe was ever re-recorded for any other album. If it shows up again, it's on a compilation, or maybe it's on Kettle Whistle, I don't know, but I only knew it to be on this. So this is a deep cut, early, old school Jane's Addiction song. And I was just singing along and had so much excitement in my heart to be hearing 1%. Brought me right back. Like I said, I would for you. That's slow. I love that piece of music. My Time, the harmonica in it. Again, that's another one that I don't think that they ever re-recorded on another album. It was just on this one. And there's the Jane Says, the one that I love. Now, this is funny because the next two songs after this, Rock and Roll and Sympathy. Now, what do you think happened to young me when I hear these songs? I'm like, wow, really great song, Rock and Roll by Jane's Addiction. Really great song, Sympathy by Jane's Addiction. No, I would figure out maybe a year or two later that both of those were covers. This is what I would like to call landslide syndrome. I'm going to officially coin that right now. Landslide syndrome. Landslide syndrome is where you hear the Smashing Pumpkins sing the song Landslide, and your parents never played you one single Fleetwood Mac song growing up. So you think to yourself, wow, this is a really nice, sweet, lovely, beautiful acoustic song by the Smashing Pumpkins. And then later you go, oh, that's Stevie Nicks, that's Fleetwood Mac. And you learn, oh, it was a cover. Well, the same thing happened on Jane's Addiction Live on the first album. When I heard Rock and Roll, I didn't know it was a Lou Reed cover. And Sympathy, I didn't know Sympathy for the Devil was for the Rolling Stones. Now, you may scoff at that. You might be like, those are huge, huge songs. I know. You don't have to tell me. I know. Sympathy for the Devil, once I figured out that was Rolling Stones, then, you know, I believe Guns N' Roses would cover for Interview with a Vampire or whatever, but that is obviously a huge fixture song that shows up over and over and over again. But at this time, it's not like my parents were showing me the best of the Rolling Stones, the best of Lou Reed, you know, and it wasn't playing on MTV. So I didn't know at the time that those were both covers, but they're excellent covers. I still have a real big soft spot in my heart for the Jane's Addiction version of Sympathy for the Devil, which is just titled Sympathy on this. And then before we get into Nothing Shocking, like I said, it's the double album day. Before we get into Nothing Shocking, Chip Away. It's just this weird tribal drum, kind of chaotic, like you're high, like you're taking some drugs or something, or at least I thought. But I have such a sweet memory of my brother and I on a hike, and we're on these trails, and he's this makes me so happy. Joel, I don't even know if you ever listen to this show. I know you've been on it, but we're on this hike and we're walking, and the trail splits up and it splits down. So I can see him up there and I'm down here, whoever was wherever. There's a lyric in there where all of a sudden the song drops out. And you can hear the drumsticks kind of rattling on the side of the snare. And he's like, I took the high road and you took the low road. We both wore dirty faces. Like he says that. And I remember being on this hike with my brother and we're looking at each other and we go, I took the high road and you took the low road. And we both are like, we both made dirty faces. And I was like making a face at him. He's making a face at me. It just always reminds me of that. So I'll always love that random, crazy, chaotic piece of music because it takes me right back to my brother and I clowning on these songs. It's fun to remember. But that being said, that was Jane's Addiction Live, 1987, on cassette. This tape that made us feel like we were going to get in trouble. And I mentioned earlier that I had gone to go see Porno for Pyros. I think it was in 2022. Now, I know that Jane's Addiction opened for Smashing Pumpkins on the last tour, and I saw them as well for that, which was great. It was great to see Jane's Addiction performing together on stage and doing so many amazing Jane's songs. Dave Navarro, unfortunately, wasn't on tour. He had stepped down because of long COVID and health issues. But I think Troy Van Leeuwen, Failure, Queens of the Stone Age, stepped in. I hope I'm saying his name right. It's probably somebody's going to come for me on that, but I know it's the last name is probably pronounced differently. But anyway, I saw Jane's Addiction on that tour, and there were dancing girls on the stage. And then when I went to go see Porno for Pyros, there were girls dancing on poles. There was art. There was like somebody painting. There was so much. There were, people in drag and it was just, people walking around with like really high boots and almost like Met Gala type outfits. And that is just so them, that is so the culture of Perry Farrell and Jane's Addiction and that free love, And when I talk about the sexual stuff, I truly feel that that Perry Farrell's adoration of the female form of bodies in general, excuse me. Because I think that there's a little bit of both energies present in a lot of his work, but primarily the feminine form. He adores it. He deifies it. It's like a goddess thing. You know how sometimes that like naked imagery can be misconstrued or construed, can be understood as objectifying, right? Sexualizing. I think that sometimes when it's used in certain ways, sure, of course. I happen to really like it when album covers are a little bit risque, but that's probably from my religious youth and feeling, really repressed. But I love sexy album covers. I always have. It's been maybe because it was so taboo, but like when I saw Deftones, the Cars, the Scorpions, Nothing Shocking, Pixies, Surfer Rosa, like anytime I was like, ooh, there was something about an album cover that was sexy. Rolling Stones, what's the other one? Suede, Placebo. I could go on and on and on. I always loved those. And it wasn't just because it was like for horny reasons. Obviously, Jesus, I'm human. But I just liked the fact that it was kind of a beautiful nude or erotic image that was being paired with music. I really enjoyed it. But it might rub people the wrong way. I've had conversations before where I've talked to women and other people that were like, I don't know, it's not for me. But when it comes to Perry Farrell and Jane's Addiction, I have never felt like the use of the nudity or the bodies or the women or anything was objectifying. It always felt very elevated, deified, goddess-like, worship, adored. Like this is beautiful. This is amazing. I don't know if you agree with me, but I have felt that. But this album, what's so interesting about Nothing Shocking is if you read up a little bit about this band coming together, and at the time, Jane's Addiction has had many iterations of different members. Primarily, it's always, Perry Farrell, Stephen Perkins, and then they've had some, ins and outs with the bass player, Eric Avery, over the years, and Dave Navarro, in ins and outs. But the core that is in on the live album and then on this one are those four: Perry Farrell, Dave Navarro, Stephen Perkins, and Eric Avery. That's who we're dealing with. And Perry is older than the rest of the band members, and the band comes together. I think it's in 1985. Perry Farrell is in a band in LA called Psycom. And that band's kind of coming apart. He meets Eric Avery. He wants to start playing music with Eric Avery. Eric is never really the new official member of Psycom. They break up. And then they're trying to get this band together. They're all living in this house, this crazy, 16 artists living in this house all together, where they're hanging up egg cartons and carpets and things like that to try to mute out the sound because they're getting in trouble all the time. There's drug use, there's heroin, there's sex. It's just wild, music compound of people. And this is where the band name starts. They have somebody there in the house. Jane is her name, and she's a heroin addict. She's on heroin, and she has very interesting perspectives and stories, and she's got interesting outlooks on life, and she shares her stories in life with Perry and with Eric, and they have this, these interactions with Jane, who lives in the house. Bainter, I believe, is her name. And I think Perry is sitting with his girlfriend at the time, Casey, and she's like, well, what if you called your band Jane's Heroin Adventure or something, like Jane's Heroin something? And he's like, no, we don't want to put heroin in the name, but the Jane's Addiction is that's where it comes from. It comes from this real person living in the house that was on heroin at the time and just offered a really unique, eclectic, strange outlook on life, but was a fighter, wasn't willing to kind of stand down, had a lot of things that she believed in. So that really represented the band. So it's around this time that Perry and Eric are playing together, and they're looking for a drummer, and Eric asks his younger sister, if her current boyfriend, Stephen Perkins, is a drummer, if he'll come play with him. And he's hesitant at first because he has such a different style of music and interests. But then basically Stephen Perkins comes along and he brings Dave Navarro. And what's so wild about the pairing of all four of them is they all have very different musical sensibilities. And that's what you can hear that's so interesting about Jane's Addiction, Nothing Shocking, and Ritual de la Habitual. It's the pairing of very different backgrounds bringing together this style of music. The 1980s LA music scene was like metal, hair metal, and they talk about it a lot. They talk about it was kind of, it was a mess because everything on the Sunset Strip was pay to play, pay $500 to play the Viper Room or the Rainbow Room or whatever, pay $500. And, Perry Farrell said nobody who was any good had $500. The most talented people didn't have $500 to throw out to pay to play. So they had to figure out ways to play in LA on their own. So they went downtown and they played these concert halls, these ballrooms, these theaters, these old theaters. And this is the places like the Roxy and a place called Scream. And they're playing in these venues where Jane's Addiction is setting up, and not only are they playing live, but they're bringing out, transvestites and a motorcycle and a work of art and they're showing the world that it's an experience. It's like a church, but of the senses and of the body. It's like an artist church. It's it's got that darkness. I think I read somewhere like a voodoo church, and that's so true. There were all these videos shown to us church kids growing up that were to show the dangers of Satan or of a sinful life. And they would show these horrible, poorly made VHS tapes to show us about the end times and Revelation and, just living in sin. And I feel like Jane's Addiction would have been candidate number one to show in those videos. There's this interesting compilation from, I think it's that person online who called Everything is Terrible. They made this compilation film called The Great Satan. And I used to stay up during the lockdown and just watch it. They basically cut together all these clips from those types of films, those biblical, lessons about staying away from Satan and the enemy and the corruption. And this person put like a supercut together. It's not a very digestible film. It's like one of those things that nobody could normally get through that, I don't think, unless you had some kind of background and you wanted to see it. But I used to sit and watch it. I've watched it like 3 or 4 times. I was usually drunk, but it was an interesting experience because it's like the sensory journey of seeing all these Christian elements just back to back. But that's what Jane's Addiction felt like. They felt like a like wild orgy voodoo church. Like, this is decadent. This is bacchanal. This is sinful. This is, you're really giving in to all the pleasures of the world. And I fucking loved it. I fucking loved it. My brother felt guilt about it. I felt guilt about it, but I also loved it. That's why it still draws me into this day. It just felt like, I love this. So the band has this art style, this love style. And we all know Perry Farrell as the creator of Lollapalooza, bringing different styles together, all different bands, everybody from Susie and the Banshees to Ice Cube and, Ice-T, Body Count. Am I thinking of the right tour? I don't know. Anyway, they come together. Dave Navarro's guitar chops are from like metal. He learns how to shred. He's a rocker, right? And then you've got Stephen Perkins, who's like a deadhead. Now, I thought this was funny. Dave Navarro and Stephen Perkins were both Grateful Dead fans and followed around the band for a little while in their youth. But Stephen Perkins has this tribal element to his drumming. He loves the Grateful Dead. He's got a lot more of that jazz kind of cool influence there. Then you go to Eric Avery on the bass, who's like loves Joy Division and punk and has this really driving bass. And then you've got Perry, who likes reggae and punk, and all of these styles are coming together in such a fascinating way to create this sound. And we really hear it come together on this album, which was produced by Dave Jordan, who's famously recorded the Alice in Chains. We talked about Dave Jordan on the Dirt album, Dirt episode, Rolling Stones, countless other bands. Dave Jordan was a very, very big record producer. And this came out, Nothing Shocking came out in August of 1988. I think it's August 23rd. But essentially, we're going on, it's 36 years ago that this album came out. This August, it'll be 36 years, which is just crazy. This was coming out at a time that I was still pretty young. So I would not have heard this as it was releasing in 88. I would have only been, 9 or 10 years old. But once we were in on the live album and I knew about this one, I don't even know how I got it. I got Nothing Shocking with the boobies in the cover, the flame heads and everything. I got that CD, probably from a mail order thing. And I got it, and I was like, this was the first one I had before Ritual, which had Stop and Been Caught Stealing and, so many amazing songs on that album. I mean, what's incredible is by the way, I was talking about how they whited out the cover. I know if you're listening, but here on Spotify, they have Jane's Addiction. It's the white cover with the Article 1 from the Constitution and the Parental Advisory. That's the cover that I remember having. But on Ritual, of course, is 3 Days, which is just an opus, a 10-minute opus, and it's incredible. But I owned Nothing Shocking first, and Up the Beach starts with just this kind of like, how do you put that? It's like an instrumental piece almost, with just this guitar wailing over these oohs and ahs and him saying home, like you're standing on a shoreline and you're about to be brought out to sea with the most wild party cruise of your life. That's what's going to happen. And then you get into Ocean Size, fantastic song, Had a Dad, written from the perspective of Eric Avery discovering that the father who raised him wasn't his dad, that he had that it was an adopted dad and he had a biological father. Now, Perry took those lyrics and took them further, but there's a lot of credit to be given to Eric Avery as a bassist on this album when you think about the iconic things like Mountain Song. And there's so many songs in here like Ted Just Admit It, where you hear that doo 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 ba-dum ba-dum. You know, that's all Eric Avery. He really does bring so much to the band that I don't know if he ever gets enough credit for. Had a Dad, Ted Just Admit It, which is about, at the time, Ted Bundy was on trial. You know, he was on trial for all the murders, and so this was a whole thing kind of pointing out the sex is violence, you know, the media taking this serial killer story and just running with it and making it so much hype. You know, these little audio clips in there. Standing in the shower thinking, cute song. I wouldn't say Standing in the Shower Thinking is one that I spent a lot of time with, but this is a hot take. Mountain Song is on this album, and it is one of my favorite of all time Jane's Addiction songs. But my hot take is this. My favorite song on this album is Summertime Rolls. My favorite song on this album is Summertime Rolls, and I stand on that. Now, I love Mountain Song, and I will crank that in my car. I made a video about it. Mountain Song is famously every bass sound check at every concert for like 20 years. If you went to a concert and they were checking the bass, somebody up there would be playing Mountain Song. It's one of the most iconic bass intros of all time. And I love it. Do not get me wrong. I would say it is, if this was a photo finish at the Olympics, it would be here. I've got my nose at the photo finish. Ready? So here is Summertime Rolls, gold, and then here's silver, and it's Mountain Song. That's just for me personally. Summertime Rolls, Mountain Song. Very close. Very, very close. Summertime Rolls for me is the song that if I made a mixtape for you, you were going to get Summertime Rolls on there. Just the way that it builds and goes. The whole journey through that song is magic. I need to make some kind of video about Summertime Rolls because it is such a pocket of time in my life, and it takes me back. But that song is incredible. Then we get to Mountain Song. Now, you know it. If you've never really spent any time with Jane's Addiction, you know Mountain Song. Do 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 do. Coming down the mountain. So I have to tell you guys a funny little story. I'm in a cover band, 90s cover band called Temple of the Dads. And we text each other about what's on the lineup and what we're going to be performing and doing. And I'm the lead singer of this band. And we do occasionally, you know, when you're covering 90s artists, like there's certain artists that are kind of, I'm not going to be able to touch. I'm never going to be able to do Chris Cornell. I have a very difficult time sometimes with Lane Staley's high notes from Alice in Chains, Shannon Hoon, Impossible, these vocalists, and Perry Farrell is another one of those vocalists that it's like, I can't get to that note. I can't get to that range. So they said on the text thread, we're like, we should try Mountain Song. And I wrote on the text thread, I was like, you guys, I can't do Mountain Song. And they were like, well, you could just sing it in your own register. I got to tell you, we went to band practice on Sunday and I tried doing it. I have this pedal which will harmonize with you and help fill out things a little bit more. I've used it on some of the songs to make it sound fuller, but we tried it and it sounded like dog shit. And I was like, I don't know if we can cover Mountain Song unless people will be able to hear me singing an entire octave lower and it sounds normal. So if you're hoping to see us perform Mountain Song at a Temple of the Dead show, not anytime soon, unless I can have my testicles removed. Because, oh my God, Perry Farrell still has this soaring high voice. And then I don't know if you knew this, but Mountain Song deals a lot with Perry Farrell's mother's suicide. I actually didn't know that. The Cash In Now. Those are lyrical references to that. And I had no idea. You know, you listen to this song that feels so epic and, you know, triumphant. Like for me, Mountain Song is just like the video I said. It makes you feel like you're on a mountainside. They made a video for Mountain Song and it was just them playing live at the Roxy, I believe. And they gave it to MTV and they're like, no, there's a naked woman in this video. So they had to do something that trimmed all that out and just showed the live footage. I feel like all the videos of Jane's Addiction, there's always a camera down by their legs just pointing up towards their crotches. Again, there's that sexual energy of Jane's Addiction. It was always like Perry Farrell standing like straddling, and then the camera's like pointing right up, and then it'd pan over, and there's Dave Navarro. Dave Navarro was definitely somebody that I felt like had a sexual energy to him too, but like in a magician type way. But I will say, he's cool. Don't get me wrong. He was very cool. He during the 90s, he had those nipple rings, those hoops. And this is a true story. This is me being so, this is when you have a podcast where you're the guy who like shares the stories. You're like, fine, I have no shame. I'll just tell you the thing. I thought his nipple rings looked so awesome that I wanted to have them too. I was living in Wheaton, Illinois. I was going to Wheaton North, and I wanted to have the nipple rings, the 2 silver nipple rings like him, because I thought they looked awesome. And I was hanging out with this friend, and there was no way my parents were going to let me go get my nipples pierced. And it seemed like a crazy idea anyway, but we had some drinks. This was really the first time that I started like experimenting with drinking during high school, this year that I was living in Wheaton and miserable. And I tried with this friend to numb it with ice and tried to pierce my nipple by myself. When I tell you that I screamed so loud, the needle got halfway through the nipple and I hit some kind of nerve, and it was so terrible. I stopped, and no thank you. No thank you. Good on you, Dave Navarro, for having those through your nipples, but that hurt like a bitch. And I stopped, and no. But then we get to Idiot's Rule. Idiot's Rule is, I did not know this, but it has guest horn section on Idiot's Rule is Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers and from Fishbone. A guy from Fishbone. Angelo, I believe. I'm not gonna be able to look it up in time. I'll see if I can find it real quick. So Flea and Fishbone on Idiot's Rule. Let's see how quickly we can get this up. Yeah, Idiot's Rule. Yeah, Angelo Moore. I was right. So Flea and Angelo Moore from Fishbone and Christopher Dowd. They were playing horns on Idiot's Rule. I actually never knew that. I didn't know Flea played the trumpet. Apparently he was a trumpet player, and he was good enough, and they were wanting to add this kind of cool element to that song while in the studio with Dave Jordan, and they were like, hey, we know some of the best players in town. We hang out with them all the time. So they invite in Flea, they invite in Angelo and Chris from Fishbone, and they add in the horn section. I actually never knew that until just recently. Then we get to Jane Says, which this is the radio-friendly version, the one that's probably heard around the world more than anything, and it's got the steel drums. It's a great version of the song. I do like this version of the song, but again, if you've never heard the one off the first album live, I think that's where it's at. Now we get to Thank You Boys, which just sounds like a musical interlude that you don't care. Just do-dee, do-dee, do-doo, do-dee. It's very loungy, ba-ba. And then all of a sudden Perry Farrell at the end goes, thank you, boys. And there's applause. When I was growing up, we used that song when making like home movies. We would use it as like a lounge piece of music. I remember several of the home movies I made. We had Thank You Boys in there. But I recently learned that the story behind Thank You Boys was anytime they were playing live and a speaker would blow or there was a sound problem or something needed to be set up, Steven, Eric, and Dave would play that little loungy thing. And it was like what they would do every single time. If there was an issue, they would do the loungy thing. So if you were a fan of Jane's Addiction and you'd seen them live, you knew that Thank You Boys that's what that was. So if you got this album, that was like a tip of the hat to the fans that saw them over and over again, seeing them multiple times. This loungy piece of music was, hey, every time you see us play and we do that little filler, well, here it is on the album. And then we close out with Pigs in Zen. And like I said, Pigs in Zen is a great song. Leave a message, call you back. It's a great song. But again, I think because my entry point was on the live one, I just love that rant in the middle. That's nothing shocking. I knew I could talk a while on this. I knew I could get into some of the feelings that I had of this album and the kind of orgy quality of this band, that four musicians from such different paths would come together. And there was tension. There's tension during Nothing Shocking. There's tension because Perry, as they're signing the deal with Warner Brothers and they're putting this together, he learns about publishing rights and he learns about kind of the split. And he realizes, like, well, this is kind of my band and I am definitely writing the bulk of the lyrics and the music and the songs. And his vantage point was, he was older too. He's like, I'm definitely bringing the most to the table. I'm not telling them they can't do what I'm doing, but I am doing it. So when it came down to negotiating, he requested more. And so everybody else, he would have basically, more than half of the rights to everything. And then they would split amongst the remaining members what was left. Dave Navarro famously wore a t-shirt at the time that said 12% on it because that's all he was getting paid. And this caused a huge amount of tension in this band. Huge. Because it was a slap in the face to the other three members that they felt like, oh, we're just not as important. And that really drove a wedge between the whole project, and they were already on the verge of breaking up. They almost broke up while making Nothing Shocking. There was a practice where Dave Jordan drove up and they were all in a car and basically Perry said to Dave, the band's breaking up. There's not going to be an album. So they brought in like a Warner Brothers mediation to fix it, solve it. So they got through this. They get through the next album. But again, the music for Nothing Shocking and Ritual were all written before both of these albums were recorded. They had 18 songs that they'd been playing live with for years. So when they go in the studio, it's not like they're writing the album. They just were making the decision as to which songs. And it's said that Perry Farrell made the choice. He's like, look, we're not putting Stop on Nothing Shocking. We're not putting 3 Days on Nothing Shocking. We're not going to put, these songs because they're not ready to be out there yet. They're bigger songs. They're ready for the next release. So he smartly kind of withheld them. And he was right. It was much better to have those songs go on the follow-up once they'd gotten more attention and more acclaim and really solidified themselves as, it's been said that Perry Farrell is the godfather of alternative. And you'd be hard-pressed to argue against that. Sure, there were others that were doing it before him, but this is a guy who was rocking in a band called Psycom in 1985 doing his own thing. And by the time Jane's Addiction is coming along, this is 87. This is so early. And for those of you who are older than me, you were watching MTV and you were seeing the Bauhaus and you were seeing the alternative music, the goth scene and the Euro pop and the punk and whatnot that was coming up in the 80s that I was missing because I was too young, the underground, right? But this was somebody who was really starting to bring all of these styles to the forefront, and you've got to give credit to Jane's Addiction for really being one of the first major alternative bands to get the recognition, to open up the scene and pave the way for what would happen in 1991. Without Jane's Addiction, that's a red carpet for a lot of these bands to have all of these styles come together. And I thought it was interesting because I read about it too, that Dave Navarro's guitar, he was using this effect. I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was a guitar effect, like a processor that caused this kind of swirling echo. And when he first started playing with Perry Farrell, Perry was using it on his voice. And he thought that was an interesting kind of synergy, symbiotic relationship. These two both using the swirling. There's swirling guitars, there's swirling vocals. But like I said, they would have this tension about the rights, which they would then solve later. They would come around and grow up and become adults and realize he had justified reasons for wanting what he wanted, but we just didn't understand at the time. And they came to grips with it. They understood, and they figured it out, and they've all played together and come back. And Jane's Addiction has lived on and toured with the Smashing Pumpkins, like I said, and right now, Porno for Pyros is doing their farewell tour. But I don't think we've heard the last from Jane's Addiction, to be honest. But this album, I know we talked a lot about the body and sex and fucks and, all those things. But I think that that's a big part of this band. And I was excited to do it. Really takes me back to that era in my life. But that being said, I think we've covered 2 albums back to back in this episode that will give you an overview of what it was like to have Nothing Shocking. And if you've never heard that first live album, I highly recommend you do. It's got a great energy behind it. It really captures what I think it must have been like to see Jane's Addiction playing live in LA in 1987. I think Dave Jordan had been told before he agreed to produce the record in Nothing Shocking, he'd been told, you gotta check out this band. And they'd sent him all these songs. He heard them, drives to LA, sees this club where there's thousands of kids lined up outside to see Jane's Addiction play. They really had cultivated a major scene here that I wasn't here for. Like I said, I was young. I didn't live here. But that is Jane's Addiction. That is what a wild band. What a wild group of people that came together to create the music that they did. So thank you for joining me this week on Waterproof Records. That was a lot of fun to talk about. And I had a lot of fun reminiscing and just sharing the stories about me and my brother and the Christian guilt that we felt. And I'm glad I didn't throw any of my Jane's Addiction away. Still have it. So thank you for joining me for Waterproof Records. I've been your fearless now, once fearful host, Jacob Givens. And I just am so grateful for you. I hope you're telling people to check out the show. I've been talking to a couple new guests coming up on the horizon, and I'm excited because I've got some cool episodes coming up soon. But I can't make the show without this growing and continuing to become a well-known podcast. So please spread the word. Give me those comments. Give me those likes or whatever. And we'll keep doing the show. Make sure you check out distrokid.com/VIP/waterproof. Get that 30% off. And we'll see you next time on Waterproof Records. Adios.
Things are gonna change. I can feel it. If this gonna be that kind of party, I'm gonna